Hello, welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I am Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan, and we post a video every week. So why not subscribe and press the alert button so that you can keep up with our adventures?
And if you've got a burning, and it's got to be burning horticultural question for Stephen, put it in the comments below, and I was going to say you will answer them in 60 seconds every Monday.
Yes, so there's 2 hits of the Horticulturalists every week.
But if you do ask the question, do say where you're from. Another bit of housekeeping, any plants that we mention in this video are included in the text below. If you can't see it, just click read more and all will be revealed. Talking of which, Stephen, where are we?
All right, well, we're at a nursery in the Dandenong Ranges, which is about 45 minutes from the centre of Melbourne, called Conifer Gardens. And that gives a hint. What do they
sell?
Yes, well, not many prizes will be given to those who work out what, in fact, Conifer Gardens sell. But they do have one of Australia's best ranges of conifers, from the tiniest miniature right up to great towering trees.
Sounds great. Well, what are we going to cover in this video?
Well, I thought we might discuss dwarf, miniature, smaller conifers in this particular video. How to grow them, how to use them, how they're propagated, where they arise from, a whole range of different sort of aspects of conifers, including fashionability. There's another one that we'll probably cover as well.
Because
so lots.
I am a child, the late 60s actually, but in the 60s and 70s in Britain where I grew up, there was a big moment of rock gardens. Every suburban house had a rock garden and sort of small, bally, dwarf conifers. Then I think, is it fair to say, they completely went out of fashion?
Yeah, they were seen as those sort of suburban things that people, of course, didn't want to admit they were from the suburbs, or in fact were engaging with anything suburban whatsoever. And it was partially due to the conifers that were being grown. It was always those sort of neat little bally things. And I don't think there was enough diversity offered to people to show them what they could really do with conifers.
Well, I think, just scanning behind us, we are here to show you diversity. There are amazing things here. So without further ado, we should go and leap in and go and look at some specific dwarf conifers.
What a good idea.
Well, Stephen, as every good school debater will say, we should define our terms. So
yes,
what is the definition of a dwarf conifer?
Well, I have to say it can be dependent on who you are to a certain extent.
I mean, how tall you are?
Yeah, well, or what you see as a dwarf conifer, because really, strictly speaking, dwarf conifers are small versions of larger conifers, so they can have various heights and still be a dwarf of that species. So you could have a quite large growing conifer. It could be something that perhaps grows to 3 or 4 meters tall, but the original form it arose from might grow to 30 or 50 meters tall, and so it would still be classed as a dwarf form of a bigger version.
Even though it would be three times the height of me.
Yeah, so dwarf can be sort of taken in lots of ways. It's also, to a certain extent, from the home gardener's perspective, it's about how long it takes as well.
Right.
So most of the things we would class as dwarf conifers are conifers that have a quite slow growth rate, and although in time they can often get up to be quite large plants, they're going to take so long to do it that it probably isn't going to make a great difference to the current gardener who's looking after the property, if I don't put too fine a point on it.
You mean you'll be dead, Stephen?
Yes,
you'll be dead.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Well, actually, that reminds me of Cameron Lodge, that wonderful garden we visited up in near you, Mount Macedon.
Yep.
And Mr. not Mr. Cameron, the next owner.
Yeah, Mr. Morgan, who was the one who was the conifer freak.
Planted a lot of dwarf conifers, maybe at the height of their fashion.
Yep.
And then they suffered from being out of fashion by being cut out.
Yes, exactly, yes. Well, and plants do come and go in fashions. You mentioned the conifers being really popular with the rock garden trend. They tended to go out. In Australia, a lot of conifers disappeared out of cultivation more because they weren't seen as native. And when we went into our big native phase in the 1960s and later, a lot of exotic plants were actually left behind because they weren't considered to be appropriate to be planting because they weren't native.
Yes, although we have native conifers here, don't we?
Well, we do have a range of them, but you tend to find people who come in looking for native plants are rarely looking for a conifer, unless it happens to be a Wollemi pine, and people who are looking for conifers aren't looking for native plants. So some of our native conifers,
twain shall meet.
yeah, they tend to fall between stools.
Now, as we are, one of the great things about this nursery is that it's surrounded by mature gardens, and we'll do a different film about that because I think it's amazing to see how you can use these plants. But here behind us
Yes.
we're calling this a dwarf conifer.
Oh yes, definitely. This is a form of Picea glauca called albertiana conica, and it was discovered in Alberta, Canada.
Yeah.
I believe by some guy who got off a train at a stop to have a rest break and saw these tiny little seedlings growing there that looked weird, dug them up, took them home, and they turned out to be this, well, I guess you could call it semi-dwarf form, although this plant is what, 2.5 meters tall perhaps,
Yeah.
and easily 30 or 40 years old. So
I guess to your point about time, if you are going to be using them in the garden, and we'll do a whole different piece about that, you've got to be patient. And I also, I guess, plan around it in terms of it is going to take 20 to 30 years to fill that spot. So managing that in the interim.
yeah, and that can be one of the really difficult things about using conifers because they don't like a lot of competition around them. So they don't want to have plants sort of swamping over the top of them because they'll quite easily get swamped out.
Yeah.
So they need to have breathing space. So generally speaking, the whole rock garden idea was actually quite a good one because you used your dwarf conifers as the major feature plants within that rock garden setting. With rock, obviously, and then you had little alpine plants and little tiny mat forming things. So you created what was like a miniature mountain scene.
Yeah.
And the conifers then became the major feature plant. The same can be said of Japanese style gardening as well. The conifers tend to become the major feature and they just slowly grow over a period of time and they're surrounded by rock and moss and what have you.
We'll get into the Japanese sort of, well, Japanese gardens, but also Japanese trend in a minute because there's some great things. But I think, so further to that, the whole slow nature of growing, this one you can see quite clearly is grafted. But let's go and talk about propagation with that Japanese one that you mentioned over there, because there's quite a story to be told.
All right. All right, I suppose one of the things we need to define a little bit about dwarf conifers, I mentioned the fact that occasionally a dwarf seedling will arise.
Like our friend in Alberta.
Yes, that's right, exactly. And so that happens. So people who are keeping tabs on large quantities of small seedlings growing will often find there'll be a bit of genetic variation.
Yeah.
So if you're an observant nursery person or home gardener and you've got young seedlings coming along, if you keep an eye on it, you might well find the dwarf one or the coloured needled one. So sometimes a gold one will arise and what have you.
Ones here.
But there's another way that dwarf conifers arise, and it's quite common amongst pines for some reason or another, and that is a condition called a witch's broom. Now,
okay, are we going to malign witches?
no.
Tell me.
No, you know, I love Halloween. So witch's brooms are a congested piece of growth that erupts in a normal sized tree.
Yes.
So you might have a normal pine tree growing, and then in the middle of it, in the middle of it, you'll have this really tightly congested piece of growth. And witch's brooms are generally thought to arise due to infestation of a fungal or viral thing that goes on, disrupts the genetics of the plant and produces this congested growth. And if you propagate from that congested growth, you nearly always end up with a miniaturized version of the big tree.
Wowza.
So yeah, so witch's brooms are definitely worthwhile looking out for, although generally whenever I find one, it's 95 feet up in a tree somewhere and there's no way I'm going up there to try and get a piece.
Well, you've got to be very committed to propagation of your witch's broom to...
Or be a sharpshooter. That is actually...
Shooting them down, my goodness.
That is a way that can be dealt with. And I know of people in certain parts of the world that actually shoot pine cones out of the trees as well. So you don't have to climb up and get them. You get a gun and you shoot them out of the tree.
My goodness.
So it can be done. Yep.
Well, I don't think we're really promoting gun usage in the garden concept. Okay, so we were a little segue about propagation then. So taking material from this sort of anomalous growth.
Yeah.
But let's just go over in front of this Japanese pine and talk about propagation generally.
Yeah, all right.
Now this is a very handsome tree, Stephen. What's this one?
Well, it's commonly called a Japanese umbrella pine,
Yeah.
which is a bit of an issue because it's not truly a pine.
Oh, well, I was going to say, and it doesn't look like an umbrella. You know, the umbrella pines you think tend to have a wide crown.
It's called an umbrella pine because the needles radiate like the spokes of an umbrella.
Aha.
So that's where the common name comes from. And it's a thing called Sciadopitys verticillata. And so,
Sciadopitys.
yeah, and it's in its own genus. There's only one species, and there's all sorts of issues with this. I mean, with the true pines, if you want to propagate a dwarf version thereof, they're nearly always grafted. But you have to graft like on,
in some of the other pieces.
So you have to graft like onto like.
Yeah.
So pines tend to have clusters of needles, and that's one of the defining things about true pines. They have their needles in clusters, and they can be 2-needled pines or 3-needled pines or 5-needled pines or whatever.
Yeah.
As long as you graft onto a similarly related pine with the same number of needles in a cluster,
Yes.
then you're generally going to end up with a good union that will last forever.
Right.
The problem with Sciadopitys is
That's
because
very Jane Austen. It's
yeah.
a great union. It will last forever.
yeah, Sciadopitys doesn't have anything it can graft it onto because it is in
one
fact
of a kind.
it's one of a kind. I mean, there's different varieties thereof that have arisen in cultivation, but it is the one variety. It's quite hard to propagate from cuttings. You can't graft it onto anything else because it's not related closely enough to do it. And so the only other way to grow Sciadopitys is to grow one long enough that it will set cones and you can raise it from seed.
So this then sets up two questions. So firstly, if you're propagating any of the conifers by cuttings, how and when?
Yeah.
And if you're propagating them by seed, I mean, because cones can stay on these trees for quite some time. So when are they ripe? You know, we talked about shooting them down. When would you harvest seeds? How long does it take for the seed to mature and be viable? And how long would germination take? I know there's many pines and many different...
Yeah, and in fact, there's not really one answer either, unfortunately.
Okay, try.
Well, I'll do my best. Certainly, when pine seed is ripe, the cone is normally quite dark brown. So the cone will no longer have any green in it. So even though they stay up in the tree, in many species, they actually stay closed until there's a weather pattern that suits them, or even a forest fire that comes through. And then the cones will open. And they will open then.
Clever.
So if you can get them out of the tree when they're brown and look obviously ripe, then lay them into a cardboard box or onto newspaper somewhere in a warm, dry area. The cones will start to open of their own accord and they will shed their seed. So, Pinus culturi, the big cone pine, funnily enough. So you can collect the seed then. I would sow most conifer seed as soon as I can get it. I would prefer to sow in the autumn so that they can have a winter cooling period and then hopefully germinate the following spring. But I would sow when the seed comes my way. In fact, I've occasionally found pine cones that I've opened or have opened themselves, and they've actually got seeds starting to germinate inside the cone because moisture had got in and started the germination of the seed. So that can quite often happen with conifers.
And I guess it depends from species to species, but do you gently cover them? Do you not cover the seeds, or do you cover them like with an inch of...
All right, well, most conifer seed is comparatively large compared to perhaps other groups of plants. So it's quite a larger seed that you can actually move around and deal with quite well, so you can space them nicely. And they basically need to be covered with about as much material over them as the diameter of the seed. So
not much.
Yeah, so just cover them gently. And just another little hint, which we did mention in our video on seed raising, get some leaf litter, or not leaf litter, really the soil under the leaf litter, under a large pine or cypress, and sprinkle that into your seed raising mixture, because you'll hopefully move some mycorrhiza in there, which will help with germination and growing on your young pine trees.
Interesting. Now, a sidebar, I've actually grown two different types of conifer from seed. I live in an older area of Melbourne where there is lots of mature conifers, pines, junipers, whatever. And there were two that I just loved the form of, so I've collected seed and they've both grown, germinated.
There you go. I'll have to ID them for you one day.
It was relatively easy, so then cuttings.
All right.
Just wouldn't have thought you could take cuttings from this family, but anyway.
Oh yeah, a lot of conifers will strike from cuttings. You tend to find things that are cypress relatives, juniper relatives, all that group, the sort of scaly needle, scaly foliaged conifers are generally easier to strike than those that have needles.
Right.
So they're reasonably easy to strike from cuttings. I would generally do them with a bit of gentle bottom heat under them. I would definitely dip them in a liquid hormonal treatment to try and seal the cutting and to get the callus tissue starting. And I normally take my cuttings, well, it depends. If they're really dwarf conifers, you're only going to get minute cuttings. But if they're a bigger growing conifer, you can do your cuttings up to around about, I'd say about 3, 4, 5 inches long.
And is it the new spring growth you take?
Yeah, you'd take the tips because you want in most conifers you want an apical growth, so you don't want to take
apically dominant trees. We've covered this.
Yes, we have in one of our other videos. So yeah, I would take tip cuttings off most conifers. Sometimes they're very slow to take roots, so you have to be very patient with them. And they can live off the sap within the cutting for months sometimes before they actually send roots. And in fact, they can be dying anyway, but still look green for an awfully long time.
Goodness.
So yeah, so it can take quite a long time.
I think you should just come to a specialist and buy them.
Well, there is that, and that's the other thing that we should really discuss, particularly when it comes to dwarf and miniature conifers. It's the time lag that's involved in getting a plant ready for sale. So people will often come into a specialist nursery like this one, and they'll see a plant in a 20 centimetre pot, an 8-inch pot, and it might be $30, $40, $50 for this little tree. It might even be more, depending on what it is.
Yeah.
If it's been grafted, well, that's a lot of handling and fiddling and what have you to get that plant ready. And if it's a particularly slow miniature conifer, you might only be getting something that's a few inches tall, but it could easily be 5, 6 or 7 years old. So you've got to understand that you're paying for the time that the nurseryman puts in. And I have to say, even as a nurseryman that does propagate a lot of their own material, if I wanted something for the garden at home that was going to look something, I'd go out and buy a decent sized one because you're buying time.
That's very philosophical.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we should go and look at all the seedling plants and just look at the variety, because the colour, I must say, I'm a little prejudiced against conifers generally. However, I've drunk the Kool-Aid.
Good.
They're amazing.
Well, they are, and there's far more to them than people realise, both in colour, shape, form, and they have texture that you can get in virtually no other group of plants.
Okay.
So that's something that you need to consider. I mean, how many plants do you know that have texture that even vaguely looks like a lot of these conifers that are around us here? So they can add to a garden in a huge way.
I'm convinced. Let's go.
All right, let's go.
All right, Stephen, let's just talk a bit about colour, because this is quite extraordinary, and we'll show you some other ones. But what is this one?
Well, this is a dwarf form of pine. So this is a Pinus mugo, which is the Swiss mountain pine, and it's called winter gold. And what you don't realise about it is it's bright gold now, but come summer it'll be bright green. So it changes golden with the cold weather.
Right. So we'll get to climate. Now, we just saw a mature specimen of this, which we'll drop in the footage now. How old is this plant, do you think? And this is a grafted one, which you can see there.
From the point of graft, this would be around about 2 to 3 years old.
Right. So, and how old is that mature one, do you think?
About 30 years old, I would imagine.
Wow. And that was only about 1 metre tall.
Yeah, so quite a small pine. You could reasonably call it a dwarf pine, although funnily enough, Pinus mugo, the original species, is not a particularly big growing pine in its own right, because it comes from up in the mountains in Switzerland and Austria, places like that. And it can actually in the wild be semi-dwarf, mainly due to climatic conditions.
So we can talk about climate in relation to this one. So what are some basic conditions for growing conifers?
All right. Well, quite obviously, anything in this sort of group doesn't care how cold it gets. So you can be in Canada, you can be in Scandinavia, you can be in lots of places. These trees will cope with really cold conditions. So that's fine. They're not generally good in the sort of tropical type countries. They're surprisingly heat tolerant though. I find in the Australian climate, as long as their root system is kept cool, either with the mulch or by their roots being able to go down under rocks and things, they're surprisingly tough to the heat here as well. So they can go in both directions. Very few of them like damp conditions though. They like good drainage. Otherwise, they're very easygoing and comparatively straightforward plants.
Now, so we're in the Dandenong Mountains, which is a higher elevation obviously than Melbourne, and it is cold today, we can attest. So you've got your golden foliage. If you were growing this, say, in Melbourne, in a more temperate climate, which doesn't have the cold, it doesn't sort of get below 0 centigrade or 32 Fahrenheit, it doesn't frost. Would you still get that colour?
You'll get gold. It may not be quite as intense as all. And it's the same with deciduous plants with autumnal colour. It's often the amount of cold you get that will help bring up the intensity of the colour. So yes, it'll still know it's winter and it will still go gold, but it may or may not be quite as strongly coloured.
And just to clarify, is this the old growth that turns gold, or are these new growths that are turning gold, which are gold?
It's the growth that was produced the previous season because it hasn't produced this year's growth yet. Because pines always send up one set of growth and they do that in the spring.
So these, now they'll change back again because they don't shed. Oh my goodness! So it oscillates.
Yes. So they don't. It's not like a deciduous plant that colours and sheds its leaves. The needles on this pine will go gold in the cold of winter, then they'll go back to green in the summer, and then the next year, as long as they're still on the plant, they'll go back to gold again.
Wowza! But of course, there are some deciduous members of the family, but we're not going into that. All right. Well, I think there's some more colours around here, which I just want to show people.
Yeah, we should have a look at the gamut of colours that you can get to prove to people that just because they're not a flowering plant, that they can't be colourful and showy in a garden.
And that mature specimen is midwinter and it's freezing, and that is such an amazing burst of this incredible gold.
And I actually have a soft spot for this particular tree because it goes gold in the winter, which is really useful because it gives you winter colour. Gold in the summer can sometimes just look chlorotic and sick. But in the summer it's not, it's green.
All right, now my favourite subject, variegation.
Yeah, we're going to have to deal with that in conifers as well.
Let's go and have a look.
Yeah.
Okay, Stephen, my favourite subject, variegation.
Yes, conifers variegate just as other plants do, but they do it in a different way. It's not a needle by needle variegation as a rule like it is in broadleaf plants where you get a white margin around a leaf or a gold centre or whatever. Conifers will variegate by throwing splashes of gold or silver or white through the individual plant. So here we have a form of Chamaecyparis lawsoniana, which is variegated, and you've got a Chamaecyparis obtusa, which is variegated, called sparkles. And you can see that they both have the same sort of variegated form, and this is fairly characteristic of variegated versions of conifers. And although they have green bits through them, which they have to survive, you don't have to panic about them, generally speaking, like you do with some variegated broadleaf plants where a green bit shows up. You have to take that out. With these, you leave the green bits in because they will generally start to variegate again from the tips.
Interesting. And like other variegated plants, I guess the seeds are an issue because you don't know. Well, variegation isn't passed through seed, is it?
Normally not. I mean, there are examples where it is, but generally speaking not. So these variegations will have shown up in a normal green version of the same conifer. Somebody's noticed them, started propagating them from cuttings, and then you would just keep taking cuttings off the same variety as time goes on, but always try and take your cuttings from pieces that have a little bit of both. That way you can feel reasonably confident you're going to pass on the variegation.
Okay, well, there's variegation, but then there's also colour.
Oh, yes.
So let's just go and have a look at some coloured options.
Yes, what a good idea.
Okay, Stephen, colour. Now, look at these two together. Amazing.
They are remarkable. Now, some of them have colours like that pine I showed you before that will change throughout the season. So this form of Thuja occidentalis, which is called Rheingold, tends to go more goldy colours in the winter, will tend to go back to more greenish colours as the summer comes on.
So you need to bear that in mind when you're planting your
But it's just like planting things that have flowers on them. You're not going to have the flowers all year round. So, you know, it's the same with your conifers.
Okay.
Others, like this one here, which is a form of Chamaecyparis lawsoniana, called Barry's Silver, has a permanent silver version. So it's going to stay that sort of silvery white colour year round.
Now, a question. Some sort of silvery plants are more sort of drought tolerant, they're more salt tolerant. Is that the same with conifers? No.
No, well, some of the true sort of bluey silvers might be, but in fact, this is sort of actually a white variegation in a sense.
Right.
And this will burn.
Right.
So if you put this out in a really hot sunny spot, it will get dreadfully burnt by the sun. So you need to be careful how you place some of these.
But generally, they all love full sun, don't they?
Generally speaking, the vast majority of garden conifers that you're likely to come across in the nursery are nearly all sun lovers.
Right.
Yes.
So if you're not going to burn this, where would you plant it to protect it?
Well, you'd take it right out of that really hot afternoon sun. So you give it some morning sun, perhaps the late afternoon sun can come in, but you've got to keep it out of that really blasting hot sun in the middle of summer.
Okay, then we've got 2 other colour options
Yep.
at our feet.
All right.
I have look at this one.
Yes. Yeah, that one not only has a beautiful silvery colour, but it has this amazing curly, twisty branching arrangement.
So what's this one called?
Well, this is one of the Chamaecyparises as well, Chamaecyparis pisifera, curly top, which is sort of a fairly obvious name, I guess.
Where are all of these from? I mean, obviously you hear the words like Mexican pine and Japanese pine, so I'm presuming there's a lot of cooler Asian species.
Well,
and
these are in fact mainly, some of these ones we've been looking at have been mainly, the original species is from Asia, but of course these are all cultivars that have shown up in gardens.
And then also the Americas, I guess, plenty of pines and
yeah. Mostly Northern Hemisphere stuff is what we're working with here. Probably we'll need to talk about Southern Hemisphere conifers in a different story.
We did. Well, we've already covered.
Well, we've done New Caledonia with their Ericoides, but yes, there's room for more as far as the Southern Hemisphere.
All right, what have you got?
Well, this one's another one that colours in the winter. So this one will go back to a sort of a silvery green in the summer, but goes this wonderful plummy purple colour in the winter.
Stunning.
And it's another one of the Thujas, another Thuja occidentalis, one called Ericoides. And it's been around the traps for decades, if not centuries.
Yeah. There you go. So, in terms of how to plant them then, these smaller plants that have either amazing colour or form or variegation, you could certainly use in perennial beds or in borders, couldn't you?
You could, as long as they're not being swamped out by the faster growing perennial material they're growing with.
Yeah.
But they do make a good, solid, permanent feature plant.
Okay, well, there is one more mature specimen we saw over there, which is tiny, but it's got amazing form. So we've done colour and variegation. Let's look at form of some of these plants.
All right, what a good idea.
Stephen, okay, so we've done colour, we've done variegation. Let's look at form. So here are 2 extremes.
Yes. All right, well, you've got a juniper there, which is one of the ground covery ones, a form of juniper squamata called blue spider, and that will make a lovely sort of matty type plant across the ground.
Now, are we still calling these dwarf?
Yes. Having said that, though, some of the natural forms of junipers are naturally dwarf. So not all junipers grow into big trees. There are quite naturally dwarf or prostrate forms in the wild. But yes, they still fit into the gamut of being dwarf conifers.
And I guess, so obviously these hug the ground.
Yes.
Some can grow taller than others.
Oh yes, there's sort of horizontally growing junipers particularly that can get up to 1 metre or 2 tall and then still go out and cover huge areas of ground. And so sometimes when you're buying these types of plants, it's not just important to ask how tall does it grow, but it's also equally important exactly to in fact know how wide it will potentially grow.
Yeah.
And a question that I always ask people to ask me if they don't think to ask it themselves is it prunable? And we'll talk about pruning as well shortly.
So what have you got?
All right, well, I've got one of the really quaint, tiny little fellows. Now, that plant there is only probably 6 inches tall, thereabouts. Now, when it's 30 or 40 years old, it might be waist height.
And we have got footage of a mature specimen that's in the garden here, which is beautiful, and it's so sculptural.
And it is, and in fact, its name is somewhat evocative because it's a form of Chamaecyparis obtusa, and it's called Spiralis because it's sort of got this slightly spirally sort of thing going on through the plant, and it is a truly dwarf conifer. So, you know, expect to pay by the inch when you buy one of these.
So there was a lot to consider when you're deciding whether to include any of this group of plants, the conifers, in your garden as a dwarf variety, that you've got either the form that it'll take, sculpturality, and also whether it's, you know, a hugger or it's upright. Then you've got its basic colour, which can change.
Yes, they often do.
And then you've got variegation.
Yes, so there's a whole range of different things in them. So it just goes to show that this group of plants have a lot more going for them than most people give them credit. And in fact, people are often quite dismissive about them. Oh, they don't flower. Oh, they don't do anything interesting. But I have to say, I think conifers have lots going for them, and we should look at them again in our gardens.
Well, I am drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
Well, we mentioned pruning a little bit. Or
Yeah.
we touched on it. Let's go and look at some extreme pruning and how you look after these plants.
All right, what a good idea.
Okay, Stephen, pruning.
Yes, well, most people have had conifers in their garden that have got slightly too big for the spot they've put them in and decided to prune them.
Yes.
And what often happens is when you cut back into old wood, the vast majority of conifers don't in fact respond. So you end up with a dead patch in your conifer because it hasn't reshot.
Yeah.
But there are ways and means of managing the size of a conifer by in fact cloud pruning it. And many conifers can be cloud pruned because what you're doing is you're trimming the greenery. You're not cutting it back into old wood. You're allowing the old wood to stay there and be exposed, and you're cutting back only the green bits at the top.
Yeah.
And so therefore you end up with a rather interesting, different sort of sculptural element in the garden by using a conifer, and you can manage it to keep it to a certain size.
Interesting. So firstly, I mean, cloud pruning is Japanese or Chinese or from both gardening traditions?
I think both gardening traditions do in fact manipulate plants in a cloud pruning style. The Japanese seem to have taken it to a completely different level, and you will see huge old pines cloud pruned in Japan with this amazing form and shape, and sometimes they can be hundreds of years old. So they're managed and kept at the same size just by the yearly pruning of those pines.
So you pointed out you can't cut into old wood, so you have to, with anything in the conifer family, you have to begin as a small plant, the cloud pruning.
No, but it depends on how big a cloud pruned plant you want to have.
Right.
So you can start with a large conifer, clean out the insides of the plant to expose the trunks, and then start pruning the balls on the end sort of thing. And in fact, I'm doing that with one in the garden at home as we speak that got too big for where it is. So by cloud pruning it, I'm managing it.
Right. But you can cloud prune anything, essentially, couldn't you?
You can look at that. It's not, it's not limited to conifers, although conifers lend themselves to it really well because of the fine texture. The cloud itself doesn't have big leafy bits sticking out of it, so you can get a much more defined shape by using conifers for cloud pruning than most broadleaf plants.
Excellent. Well, these are amazing.
Yeah, and just remember too, if the nursery's gone to the effort to start the work for you, you get to pay for that.
The other thing I've noticed, there's a lot of, well, obviously these are all in tubs.
Yep.
And you've often mentioned when we've spoken about Australian conifers that they make great tub specimens because they're so slow growing.
Yeah, a lot of them are.
So all of these, basically, could you even grow ultimately a tree that's going to be a massive specimen, not just dwarfs, in a container?
Yes, but not necessarily forever. But with root pruning, manipulating and so forth, it's surprising how long you can keep things going.
Are you alluding to bonsai?
I'm alluding to part-time bonsai.
You know my feelings about bonsai.
Well, that's another thing. I'm going to cure you of that in due course as well, because we will definitely engage with that particular art at some point or another.
Art, okay. Good to know that a lot of these will survive in tubs. I think we've covered everything.
I think, well, I'm not sure that you ever cover everything, but we've done a damn good job of trying to cover conifers, particularly of the smaller dimensions, reasonably well.
Yeah, fascinating. And I have to say, just looking at them all massed here, there is so much variety in form and colour, variegation. It's incredible. The pruning of these ones is just extraordinary. Yeah. It's an amazing group of plants.
I would definitely recommend a trip to Conifer Gardens Nursery in the Dandenongs if you happen to be out this neck of the woods. And we will link their website below so that you can go in and find out more about them.
We will indeed. And just as a caveat, they do ship within Australia. Obviously, they can't ship outside of Australia. No nursery can. And to the quarantine states. So they do ship to Queensland. But if you're in Western Australia or Tasmania, you need to just call the nursery and they can arrange that through one of their supplies in those two states.
Yep.
Thank you to Conifer Gardens for having us today on this brisk Dandenong morning.
Yes, and what a good topic to cover, conifers in the winter.
Absolutely. Now, we are going to make another film in this nursery because the mature gardens are stunning. So watch this space to see another film about how to use conifers in your garden.
Yes. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and press the alert button so that you can keep up with what we're doing each week.
Yes, and find out what our adventure might be. And if you do have that burning, and I wish it was burning today, horticultural question for Stephen, put it in the comments below and he will answer it in 60 seconds.
Don't forget to tell me where you're from for context.
It helps. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye all.